ladies and gentlemen, you're watching The Progressive American. I'm your host, Connor Kelly. Today we will be discussing something that frankly should not be an issue, the election results. On November 7th, CNN, along with other networks such as the New York Times, called the election for Joe Biden, making Donald Trump the first president since George H.W. Bush not to be re-elected. Indeed, 2020 was one of the most active elections in recent history, with voter turnout reaching levels not seen since 1900, with 66% of registered voters participating. These historic victories were unfortunately undermined by the sitting president's unusual and dangerous behavior. 3 days before the election results were called, Trump claimed that he had won. What he did not mention was that states like North Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin had slower vote counts than their neighbors due to mail-in ballots and laws restricting when they could count the votes. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan couldn't begin counting their ballots until November 3rd, meaning that they were dealing with a record turnout and were somehow expected to count all those votes on the same day as the election, much of it by hand. Although Michigan was able to alter its laws to accommodate, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania's legislature didn't bother to change their laws about when to start counting the ballots. In doing so, they pushed back the wait times. But that didn't stop Trump, as he claimed victory prematurely, making wild accusations and declarations like this.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
Since then, Trump has filed over 50 lawsuits, winning only one and getting thrown out of court almost every other time if the cases are not withdrawn for their weaknesses. Most recently, the Trump campaign lost their case in Wisconsin, and the U.S. Supreme Court turned down Trump's attempts to reverse the election for a second time. However, this time the case was brought by 17 states, with 4 requesting permission to join in. It had the support of the Republicans in the House and was being brought by Texas, whose Attorney General is currently under investigation by the FBI. This whole affair is, to put it lightly, a complete waste of time. The allegations are spurious and absurd, the conspiracy theories make no sense, and they're easily debunked. Hell, Attorney General William Barr, a man appointed by Trump, has come out and said he could not find any evidence of widespread voter fraud. Trump also found little to no support for his claims with his own election officials, as they released a joint statement earlier in November stating that the election was the most secure in American history, further stating, quote, "There is no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised," end quote. If a campaign cannot win in court and is contradicted by its own officials, then perhaps that campaign ought to end. I don't think Trump's campaign will succeed. That seems almost impossible now. But that doesn't mean there is no risk here. By seeking to undermine and overthrow certified election results, Trump is not only undermining the rule of law, but he's ripping apart the social construct that American democracy depends upon. Trump's words and the words of those who bow down to him matter. They cultivate the way the electorate reacts to the change in power and how they think about their political opponents. Fundamentally, the words of the leadership dictate how partisans react to political change. Unfortunately, Trump and those Republican officials working with him care for none of those things. When Trump denounced Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger for certifying Georgia's results, his audience listened. Now, after Raffensperger has been accused of theft in an election, or at the very least of being complicit in said theft, Raffensperger is now receiving death threats to his home, some of which are being directed at his wife. Georgia is not an anomaly either. In Michigan, the Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, has had armed men protesting right outside her house, all accusing her of stealing the election from Trump. This rhetoric is not helping anyone and borders on being fascistic. It is one thing to protest outside a government building, but to show up at an official's home is another thing entirely, especially when said protesters amount to an armed, angry crowd. The Secretary of State was not the only target. Representative Cynthia Johnson, a member of the Michigan State Assembly, was threatened with doxing and lynching. In most cases, it would be completely irrelevant what her skin color is, but the fact that she was explicitly threatened with lynching makes the implications all too real and painfully relevant. If it isn't already obvious what I'm implying, then allow me to speak more bluntly. Cynthia Johnson is black, and the fact that someone went out of their way to threaten her with such explicit forms of execution needs to be called out. This is not ending soon. This is not just unacceptable behavior. It's explicit racial and political terrorism. To be clear, I am not suggesting that Cynthia Johnson's threats are any more or any less important than the threats that the others received. But the fact of the matter is that she was threatened with a means of execution that was historically used to execute and slaughter African Americans for their political activism and for them exercising their rights. That needs to be pointed out. The historical parallels need to be remembered because they can and will play a role in our political system if we don't call them out. I imagine and hope that this violence will fade soon with little harm to the public, and maybe that optimism is well placed. With the upcoming meeting of the Electoral College on Monday, it is increasingly likely that Trump's path to victory will turn to ash in front of his followers, forcing them to reconcile with their loss. But some skepticism is always warranted. Even if we were to disregard all the aforementioned violence and hostility, which we shouldn't, America has deep cancers that need to be cut out, and Trump's rhetoric has not helped that. A Fox News poll found that 68% of Republicans and 77% of Trump voters believed that the election was stolen from Trump. Quinnipiac found similar results, as they found 70% of Republicans thought that Biden's victory was illegitimate. That said, there is some room for hope, as the Fox News poll found that 56% of Americans saw Trump's recent behavior as harmful to democracy. The Quinnipiac poll also found that 60% of Americans believe that Biden is the legitimate president-elect, signifying that perhaps America has an opportunity for reconciliation, but if and only if we are able to communicate on the same grounds. Serious change in our political culture is necessary if we are to recover. I sincerely hope that we can work together as Americans, but I am increasingly convinced that massive societal change needs to happen to prevent anything like Trump from ever happening again, even if it provokes another fight. His political malfeasance was so extensive in just this election alone that it poisoned our very ability to choose our government peacefully. While I'm all for reconciliation, and I do hope that Americans reconcile with each other, the Republicans must face a reckoning for their actions. They need to be reminded that they unleashed Trump on our country, and now it will be a Democrat pushed by progressives who will be picking up the pieces of their mistake.